Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this short course. My name is Alan Davis. I'm with Auburn University, and welcome to Auburn, Alabama. I'd like to share a little bit of our work with you today in terms of my interest in plant-based feed formulations in shrimp. And if you look at resources in terms of what's available in the world, whether it's marine animal proteins or terrestrial animal proteins, we're going to continue to move towards plant-based formulations because there's simply not enough of these ingredients in the world to expand our industry, to feed the animal industry such as poultry and pigs, as well as the aquaculture industry. We will follow the same path that poultry and the pig industry has followed and moved towards plant-based ingredients because of supply and demand. And we've done a lot of that already. If you look at aquaculture, we have about 50 to 60 million metric tons of feed, of which we're using about 15 million metric tons of soy. That constitutes about 25% of the feed formulation. So already we have a fair amount of plant-based ingredients in our feed formulations. If you look at the level of fish meal that's available to the industry, aquaculture has about 4.5, maybe 5 million at the most. Fish meal that's used in aquaculture, that equates to about 7.5 or maybe 8% of the diet feed formulation. And the reason that we're going down is because we are the biggest users. If we're going to expand our industry, we have to reduce the use of both fish meal and fish oil because we are primary consumers. Now, if you look at, it doesn't matter how you think about it from the economics, from the market standpoint, from social factors, all animal production requires the use of sustainable and expandable ingredients. So remember, something can be sustainable, but we can't expand it. Well, if we're going to grow our industry, we have to expand things. That means we have to move away from animal proteins and move more towards plant-based ingredients because those animal proteins simply are not going to expand over the future. If you look at plant-based ingredients, there are a lot of potential ingredients that we can use. They all have advantages, they all have disadvantages. But if you look at world availability, we have, from a standpoint of fish meal, there's maybe 6 to 7 million tons of fish meal, of which we use 4.5 or 5 million. You can see right here is the amount of fish meal available in the world. Almost all of our plant-based ingredients have considerably more, and of course soy has a whole lot more. The reason that I work with a lot of soy-based feed formulations is because of the availability of soy in terms of quantity, quality, and the ability to expand production in the future. Now, if you think about our 300 different species we grow in aquaculture, I view them as along a continuum. Some of them have very low tolerance to plant-based ingredients. Others have very high tolerance to plant-based ingredients. And the reality is it's processing and price that dictate how much is in those feed formulations. But in all of these species, we're moving farther and farther towards plant-based ingredients. If you think about salmon, they used to be 45-50% of the feed was as fish meal. Now they're down to around 10 or 15% fish meal in those feed formulations. So even with our low tolerant animals, take a trout or salmon as an example, we're doing breeding programs to make them more tolerant of plant-based ingredients, and that level is coming up consistently from year to year, and this is going to happen with all species. You're very lucky in Latin America. Most of the species that we work with, Pacific white shrimp, the tilapia, catfish, these are very tolerant to plant-based diets as long as they're formulated properly. Now, as we move towards these plant-based ingredients, it's very important that we understand the nutrition because it's very critical to make sure that we balance our nutritional requirements to meet those of the animal. When we're dealing with high animal protein feed formulations, quite often we're in excess of nutrients. When we move towards plant-based ingredients, we tend to bring those restrictions into where the requirements are. So we need a good understanding of those requirements. we need to make sure we balance those feed formulations. Now, just as a quick reminder, we've looked at plant-based formulations for a long time, most of my career. And we've done this very successfully. We've actually used plant-based ingredients probably for the last 15 years in our production demonstration systems. But remember, nutrition starts out in the laboratory under aquarium conditions, do a lot of work there. And then quite often we move to intermediate systems like green water or tank-based systems, and then demonstration type systems, and then out into the commercial industry. And so reality is nutrition has a long history that started a long time ago looking at plant-based ingredients. In my standpoint, well before 2000 we started looking at plant-based ingredients for vanillin. I'm just going to run through a few publications here. I'm not going to talk about them a lot, but we started off with a extruded soy poultry diet, which we thought was mostly poultry meal. It turned out it was mostly soybean meal, and that was our first indications kind of that, hey, we can open this up and we can replace a whole lot of our fish meal and our animal proteins as long as we get the formulations correct. But we went through a long series of studies to demonstrate plant-based diets in the research systems and then out into ponds. And so we first replaced our fish meal with poultry meal, then we went to plant-based diets by removing that poultry meal. We looked at a range of different matrices, and the key here is there's a lot of matrices you can use. You just need to make sure you balance those feed formulations, right? We did that on a lot of different densities. We've done it now under super intensive systems. We're at 150 per meter with some of our soy-based feed formulations. We've then finished that off with a review, and we've continued to do work in soy-based feed formulations or plant-based. But you got to ask the question, why isn't there a higher use of soy proteins in a lot of our feed formulations? Well, in some species we do have negative effects, but most of it is a perception of negative effects. The perception that we have anti-nutrients in these plant-based ingredients, and so we're going to blame that on the reason that there's no performance, or we're going to use that as an excuse not to use them. The reality is that a lot of animals are very tolerant, when the formulation is done properly, to plant-based feed formulations. So if you look at a lot of the anti-nutrients that are found in these, example soy, some of them are removed by heat, some can be removed by enzyme treatment, extraction, various processes to remove those compounds when they cause problems to animals. And what I view it as is that in our traditional solvent extracted soybean meal, where there's heat treatment, there's solvent extraction, that those are the cheapest protein sources. And then as we run into ingredient problems, well, then we move to the more processed products, which are going to be more expensive. So, as I said, why is there not a wider use of soy protein? Well, people view it as a possible reason for decreased performance, whether or not it's feed efficiency or growth, possible histological changes, alterations in serum biochemistry, so response. But this only occurs in some of the species, okay? And in those species where it does occur, we simply move to higher processed products. So if you go to the far extreme would be an isolate. You remove almost all of the anti-nutrients when you go to a protein isolate. But you can go through a series of steps to get different products. One way to improve these products is through genetic breeding. And we've had a number of projects looking at in the early stages where they're trying to identify genetic lines that should be commercialized. We've had the pleasure of looking at a lot of different soybean varieties. These are some examples of that work. But what I want to bring out is some of those early varieties that we looked at. In this case, this ultra-low oligosaccharide and this high protein line. We looked at growth trials with them and found that they do pretty well in digestibility, but they're now moving into commercial production. So we've looked at a lot of these where these are very high protein, much higher than the protein content of a typical solvent extracted soybean. So it's a very good product for protein, but also some of the anti-nutrients have been removed out of these products. So this is just an example of us looking at these different products and looking at weight gain, feed conversion. We've looked at digestibility. We actually have amino acid digestibility in our publications for this. But these two lines that I've highlighted have actually, continued on in the process, and they're now in value chain development. So they've gone from research to actual commercial production, and now they're trying to get the value chains to get those to market. But these are very interesting. These are high protein. One of them is 58% protein, and the other one is a high protein with ultra low levels of oligosaccharides. And as a reminder, we did a number of studies where we looked at all these different sources, and one of the things that negatively can affect digestibility is the presence of oligosaccharides. And so reducing the oligosaccharides is a good thing, because that's going to help with our protein digestibility. Now, so there's genetic programs that we can use to improve our plant-based feed sources, but we can also do processing. Just as a couple of examples, there's commercial producers that are doing enzyme-treated soy, so they're taking soy and going through various enzyme treatments to remove anti-nutrients and improve digestibility. There's fermentation that can be done, where we take microorganisms and basically degrade the fiber component or the cholesterol component, potentially degrading some of the anti-nutrients, and again, creating a better product. But both of these are going to cost you more money. Now, fermented soy products have been used in human history. We've fermented things throughout history of humans, and it's very popular to have fermented soy. There's a number of groups that produce these products, and there are some advantages to fermented soy. Now, realize what I view it is that these processes are best done on low quality products, and you're going to get a better benefit if you ferment a low quality product than a high quality product. So if you're starting off with a high quality solvent extracted soy that has good digestibility, you're probably not going to see a lot of benefit. But if you're talking about a poor quality soy, then going through the fermentation process is going to improve digestion. Okay. So some of the advantages, if you choose to use a fermented soy, is that some of the compounds that might affect the immune response of animals are going to be degraded. Some of these anti-nutrients are going to be degraded. You're going to take some of the protein and break it down, so you're going to have smaller molecular weight proteins available to the animal, which has both advantages and disadvantages. And then potentially you're increasing the nutritional quality, because you've basically reduced the fiber content, okay, and the anti-nutrients in that. So digestibility will tend to improve. So these have been used in fish that have allergic responses, and we've done a little bit of work with them in soy. Now, shrimp don't have an allergic response to soy, so the advantages are based on the other components of fermentation. Now, there's most certainly not a huge, what I consider a huge amount of data on fermented products, and even less in shrimp. One of my students did do a meta-analysis where he looked into the literature, reviewed that literature, and looked to see if there was benefits, and he did indicate that in general there was some benefit for having a fermented product. But again, what you really see is that if you have an allergic response to typical soy, then that's where that benefit comes in. We've looked at the fermented products as a replacement for solvent extracted soy in our Florida pompano, and yes, you could do it, but there was actually an upper limit. We were able to use higher levels of regular soy than we were fermented soy, and that fermented soy is going to cost you more money. But if you have an allergic response or something that you're trying to overcome, then that makes the extra cost makes sense. Now, as I said, dry fermentation is very popular. To me, it works best, both enzyme treatment and fermentation work best on lower quality ingredients. So as I said, if you look at fermented soy, what you really do is remove some of the anti-nutrients. You break down the carbohydrates, which tends to rise up the proteins. Now, you don't have a huge change in essential amino acids. You simply just reduced some of the carbohydrates, so that made their levels come up. Some of the non-essential amino acids, there are some pretty big changes that can occur with the fermentation process. So I don't view the fermentation process as really shifting a whole lot the essential amino acids profile. In theory, there's a little bit more protein coming in from whatever you're using for that fermentation process, so it will contribute to protein, but it's typically not very much. This is used as a feed ingredient, and it's also used by farmers as a replacement, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, there's a few studies, and there's not a lot of work that's been done with fermented soybean meals. And one of the things that we need to think about when we're looking at these studies is what was the quality of the soybean meal to begin with. In general, you're going to improve it, but quite often they're not that good a quality to begin with. But again, in this particular example with Farfentopenaeus indicus, well, they did get an increase in dry matter, protein, carbohydrates, and ash content, and they reduced antinutrients such as phytic acid and trypsin inhibitors. So it improved the quality of that soy, and it could be used as a partial replacement for fish meal. And we see that quite often where we have a little bit higher replacement for fermented products than non-fermented products. So in this example, on the bottom would be non-fermented, here is fermented, and you can see they had a higher replacement value before they had a nutritional response. And this is fairly common. Now, as I said, in our case with Florida pompano, we did not see this. We actually had a higher replacement value with solvent extracted than fermented. And again, another example with Panorama, where they've gone in and used fermented soy as a replacement for fish meal. Now, these fermented products have both positive and negative benefits in my book. At low levels, they seem to be add as attractants, but at higher levels, some of our animals, maybe it's serving as a negative attractant. I think that might be what we saw in the Florida pompano when we used them. But it does form an acidification, or you've reduced the buffering capacity, however you want to look at it. It's a source of probiotics potentially because you have live bacteria in that system. And of course, it improves the nutritional value, as I've said before. And so it's very good for species that are sensitive to soy or other plant-based ingredients that you're doing the fermentation on. Now, they also have not so positive benefits, in my opinion, is that typically the price is going to be higher. And so to me, if your animal is doing fine on a solvent extracted or a traditional, byproduct, use it because it's going to be cheaper. Now, if you have some sort of allergic response, or if you want acidification, or if you want some of the positive benefits on health, then yeah, you can justify the cost. But if we're talking simply protein digestibility, protein availability, you need to look at that in terms of what the cost effectiveness is. Now, we've ran into a lot of farmers who are using fermented soy as a replacement for the feed, so we had an interest. Now, we're not looking at the acidification, the source of bioactive compounds, or pre or probiotics. We simply wanted to know what was the nutritional value of doing this. And we find that there's a number of farmers who are doing this. So we chose to look at this, but we wanted to do a few other things in advance to confirm. And one of the things that we've been doing in the laboratory is we've been using passive acoustic monitoring in our research systems. Now, you guys may be familiar with some of the automatic feeders, which use passive acoustics to monitor the response of the shrimp. Well, we've moved the same technology into the laboratory, and you can put a hydrophone in and actually listen to what's going on with the shrimp. Now, here's a actually, a lot of it is in frequency that we can't hear, but we can record this and then it can be quantified. We've done a number of studies, and I just want to share a little bit of that information with you. So the acoustics has a lot of applications. We're using it in the lab, trying to look at some of the factors in terms of processing, the shear of that. I'm going to use kibble because it could be pelleted or extruded. The thickness of that kibble, the length of that kibble, the effects on palatability, different ingredients. And then, of course, you can look at different species, and then you can look in the environment. So, for example, right now we have 2 ponds that have blue-green algae blooms, and the shrimp are simply not eating, probably because of those blue-green algae blooms. And so if we were running regular feeding protocols, we wouldn't understand that, because we're using the acoustics. We can see that they're not consuming the feed, and consequently they're not getting fed as much, and so we're not ruining our water quality. So it's a really neat technology from the laboratory all the way out to commercial production. So in the lab, we basically do recordings in aquariums. We actually have 3 or 4 different ways we can do this, but the simplest is simply to put them in an aquarium, cover that aquarium to cut down on the noise, and then you can look at what's happening. And we've been looking at that with plant-based ingredients. And most people don't think that shrimp are going to eat a plant-based ingredient. So I went to the Google and found a few pictures of different shrimp eating plant-based things, and it's actually common to feed plant-based ingredients to shrimp, especially aquarium shrimp. So we've been looking at this in the laboratory, and one of the studies we did do is we took a commercial feed, so it had 8% fish meal in it. This was an open feed formulation, one of ours. And then we pelleted fermented soy, so we mimicked one of the commercial processes that some of the farmers are using to ferment the soy prior to feeding. Did that in the laboratory, and then we also pelleted a non-fermented soy. And we then fed this to our shrimp to see what the response is. And with the acoustics, we can see exactly what's going on. So on the left-hand side, this is a graph over time, so 30 minutes time, and this is the energy that is produced in that acoustics. And there's a number of ways we can measure this, but this is one of the simple ways. But you can see this top one is our commercial feed, and you can see they consumed a great deal as soon as that went into the water, and then that comes down over time. But then we have our fermented soy and our regular soy, and they're consumed at much lower rate, and again, come down over time. So looking at a traditional consumption where you feed the animal and then recapture what's not consumed, we also did that over a 30-minute period. And here you can see the food consumed in terms of the commercial feed, and then in this case, the fermented soy, they ate actually more than the regular soy. But these are not statistically different. So whether or not the acoustics, which shows the soy being consumed more, or the traditional feed them and then collect, which shows a little higher level of fermented soy. Bottom line is they are about 1/3 the consumption rate as the commercial feed. So it is consumed, both plain soy, and there's nothing added to these other than it's a pelleted soy or a pelleted fermented soy. They are consumed by the animals. So we do see it being consumed. So the next question is, will they grow on it? How well do they grow on it? So we did a couple of trials, both a clear water and a green water trial. Pretty much the same results, but here's our clear water system. And what we did is we took 25% of the ration, okay, and fed it either as feed or soy or a combination of the two. So here we have 25% of a ration, so a full ration for the day would be 100%. So we're giving them a quarter feeding. And then we gave them 50% ration, and then we gave them 75% ration. So we went up 25% in feed each time. There was no increase in growth. So this shows that they do grow on it, but if you go up in the quantity, you're not getting a growth response. So we then did the same ration, 25% ration for feed, and you can see it's much higher. Go to 50%, they increase. Go to 75%, they increase. 100, 125, they increase. And then we did a 25% of the ration as the fermented soy, and the rest is feed. So here it's 25 and 25, but you can see it does not equal the feed. Here it's 25 and 50. Again, it doesn't equal the feed. So on the right-hand side is a graph, and you can see the feed and then the equivalence of feed plus fermented soy, it's displaced. And that's because they're not growing as well on the fermented soy. So they are growing some. It's about 1/3 of the growth rate. We did this in clear water. We also did this in green water. We got exactly the same results. So it's clear that you do get some contribution from the fermented soy, but it's about 1/3 of what you would get from the feed. So, farmers, yes, they're going to consume it. Be careful in terms of what the economics are when you're doing this, and make sure that you're simply not overfeeding, and that by cutting out 25% of your ration and replacing it with the fermented soy, you're simply not, you are overfeeding, therefore you're now underfeeding. But we did not get equivalent growth rates from the fermented soy as the complete feed. So again, we've done a lot of laboratory work, and I'm just going to give you a quick update on some of that in terms of the work with the hydrophones. We have looked at commercial pellets in terms of the characteristics, in terms of there's a good correlation using a simple texture analyzer and the breaking of that pellet to the noise that that pellet will produce. And so we've looked at that. We've looked at a pelleted versus an extruded feed. So these were equivalent formulations. And you can see you do get differences in these two formulations due to the processing. These differences are not much, but it does look like the pelleted feed, which, remember, pelleted feed is going to shear easier. An extruded feed is more fibrous, so it's going to harder to break. And it does. If you put it on a texture analyzer, the shear is higher on extruded feed. And so you get a little bit higher noise from those animals. We've also looked at pellet length. We have not looked at diameter yet. This is simply different lengths in terms of the activity, and we've done a number of different ways of looking at that. The take home is the signature is the same, and that makes sense because they're biting through the diameter, not the length. And so the acoustic signal was identical for all three of those, but if you start looking at the number of clicks and how quickly they ate the feed, you see that there are differences. So, and it makes sense. The small feed, they consumed it very quickly. You got less of a signal, but they came down to satiation very quickly, okay? So that indicates that they're consuming more feed, they're getting satiated faster than on the larger or longer feeds. So on the longer feed, of course, they're gonna have to chew it. So as you move from small, medium to large, you get more clicks per pellet, okay? And that makes sense because they're gonna have to bite through it to eat that. So right now what this looks like is, a short cut is gonna be an advantage over a long cut. They're gonna eat it quicker and more efficiently, so to speak. And that does not cost you any difference in cost. Now, when we go to different sizes or diameters, which at this point in time we don't have data on, that is going to be different costs. The smaller the diameter of the pellet, the more it's going to cost you to manufacture it. But that'll be one of our studies hopefully in the future. So again, showing the diet length, and just to show that we broke it into 5-minute intervals in terms of what the energy is, but you can see it's really in that first 15 minutes that we're seeing the activity. And then they come down to kind of a low level of consumption. And so it's that initial feeding behavior that we've started to key in on. Now, we've looked at a number of different attractants just to show you some quick examples. So these are both plant-based ingredients and animal-based ingredients. In this case, we're looking at a soy-based diet, and then we simply top-coated it with fish hydrolysates. Krill oil or krill meal was added to the ingredients at different levels. We did growth trials, we did consumption, and we did the acoustics. And I'm just going to show you the consumption. But you can see the black right here, this is our soy-based diet, so the acoustic response is different than those with the attractants. And those that had the biggest response, and the steepness of that line means that if it's very steep, that means they got a good response. If it's very flat, they had less of a response. It does correlate to consumption. And we've done this a number of different times. But you can see right here our basal diet, when we added the fish hydrolysates, we got increase in consumption. And this is measured after 30 minutes using traditional measures. And then the krill meal, the krill oil, they all increase consumption. What's interesting, almost none of these increased the growth over time. So when we did our growth trial, there was no differences across the board. But what we're seeing is that they will consume initially faster, these feeds, but they consume about the same amount if you give them a longer period of time. So we've also, as I said, we've done a number of studies. This is another example with top coating, and in this case we had an all plant diet. We had a poultry meal based diet, so about 8% poultry meal, and then fish meal based diet with 8% fish meal. And we simply top coated with either fish hydrolysates or krill oil to see what the response would be. And again, just to show, you've got 30-minute recording, and it's a little bit flatter than the 15 minutes. So if you condense and look only at the first 15 minutes, you can see there's differences in consumption. And so that's showing that these different attractants are bringing the animals in to consume the feed quicker. The question is then, in a growth trial, and again, in growth trials, we saw very little difference. So yes, it brings them to the feed quicker, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to grow faster. And again, here's our food consumption doing traditional ways. And as you can see, you generally get an increase irrespective of what the matrix is. So again, just some more data. So we've used this acoustics for a lot of different things, and we're using it now in our research ponds. And so just to show you a little bit of last year's data, we converted in 2000 100% to acoustics. If I'd known that we were going to have a hurricane that year, I wouldn't have done solar. But we did survive the hurricane even with our solar panels. They all stayed intact. Unfortunately, our greenhouses didn't. But our solar panels and most of our feeders stayed where they should be. But this is a good technology. And what it allows us to do is do different feed formulations and allow the shrimp to decide how much to consume. So we can see if these different feed formulations actually result in different production performances when the shrimp are allowed to decide how much they're going to consume. So we did a plant-based diet, 8% poultry, 8% fish meal, and then 12% fish meal last year. And we got great performance out of everything. There's no differences in terms of feed conversion, growth, final production, basically no differences across the board. Now, I'll caution you about the feed costs because these change from month to month, place to place. I hate doing costs on feed. We gave you the formulations, you do the costs at your facilities. But in general, I mean, the trend here is the same, the exact number is not. Quite often when we do all plant-based diets, it actually costs us more money, and in this case it did. Moving to somewhere between 4 and 8% of an animal protein quite often brings the cost down. And so you can see in the 8% poultry meal, that's the cheapest diet. Then, of course, going to 8% fish meal is going to increase our cost, and then going to 12% is going to increase the cost even more. So, take-home message is that no matter what the ingredient matrix is, as long as you have proper nutrition and you select good quality ingredients, you're going to get good performance. The acoustics have a lot of applications in both ponds and research, and I think it's a really neat technology that the industry has been embracing. It's not for everybody, but I think the automatic feeders are a great technology change for the shrimp industry, and then the acoustic feeders are another step forward. We see that quality solvent extracted soybean meal is a good protein source. We've used it for the last 15 years at about 50% of our feed formulations. And that we see from all the data out there that if you take a poor quality soybean meal or other plant-based ingredients and go through the fermentation process, you will improve the nutritional value of that product. So there are benefits for using these type of products. You can also go through enzyme treatment. You can also go through fractionation. Okay, we're seeing that the on-demand feeding is very interesting, and it's allowing us to look at some of these different feed formulations. So far, we haven't seen a major difference in the choices. We went from 0 fish meal to 16% fish meal, and there was no difference in the choice that the feed made or the shrimp made in terms of consumption. Right now, this year, we're looking at a plant-based ingredient with various attractants added to it. So again, we'll build on this data to see if there's any differences. But we do see that these attractants do bring the shrimp to the feed quicker, which means less nutrients are going to be leaching out. But then, of course, the other part of that equation is the performance improved? Now, with that, I'd like to thank everybody that participates in my lab. I've got a pretty big lab. Got anywhere from 10 to 20 people in the lab, and it's the hard work of these graduate students that actually gets all this work done. I just get to go out to the industry and share the information. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions. You've got my email there, and be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the organizers giving me an opportunity to talk with you, and USEC for sponsoring me to be at this meeting. Thank you very much, and have a great day.